Most people assume UFO encounters are just stories, blurry photos, unreliable witnesses, nothing you can hold in your hand. But what happens when a man walks away with burns in a perfect grid pattern across his chest? When soil samples test positive for radiation? When metal fragments are found melted into solid rock and they're still radioactive 50 years later? What really happened in the woods of Manitoba on May 20th, 1967, when an industrial mechanic went looking for silver and found something that defied every law of physics he knew? This is the story of Stefan Michalak and the Falcon Lake Incident, Canada's most thoroughly documented UFO case. The Whiteshell Provincial Park stretches across eastern Manitoba like a wrinkled blanket of granite and pine, dotted with lakes that gleam like broken mirrors under the spring sun. Falcon Lake sits about 150 kilometers east of Winnipeg, remote enough that a man can spend hours among the rocks without seeing another soul. It's the kind of wilderness that draws people seeking silence, or prospectors chasing dreams of silver veins hidden in ancient stone. Stefan Michalak was both. At 51, he worked as an industrial mechanic, a practical man with calloused hands and an immigrant's work ethic. He'd brought his family from Poland to Canada years earlier, building a modest life in Winnipeg's River Heights neighborhood. But on weekends, he transformed into an amateur geologist, disappearing into the bush with his rock hammer and sketch pad, searching the Precambrian shield for quartz and precious metals. The May-long weekend of 1967 found him alone in the forest near Falcon Lake. He'd staked some claims the previous year and returned now to explore further. The spring air carried the scent of warming earth and pine needles. According to his later accounts, Stefan had found a promising vein of quartz and was chipping away at the exposed rock, his welding goggles hanging loose around his neck, when the geese started screaming. It wasn't the usual honking. It was panic, a cacophony of terror that made him look up from his work. The gaggle exploded into flight, wings beating frantically against the sky. And that's when Stefan Michalak saw them. Two objects, glowing with a reddish hue, descending through the clear afternoon air about 45 meters away. They moved with purpose, silent, except for a distant hum that seemed to vibrate through his chest. Cigar-shaped at first, but as they dropped lower, one of them began to change. Stefan would later tell investigators he watched one craft land on a flat section of rock, while the other hovered for several minutes before shooting upward and vanishing. The landed object transformed before his eyes, its shape settling into something more disc-like, more defined. He sat frozen, his rock hammer forgotten in his hand. This was 1967, the height of the Cold War. Secret military aircraft were being tested across North America. Stefan's first thought, the thought that would guide everything he did next, was simple. This had to be American. Some experimental craft the Yankees were flying in Canadian airspace. For 30 minutes, Stefan Michalak sat and watched. He pulled out his sketch pad, the same one he used to map quartz formations, and began drawing what he saw. The craft sat there on the rock, approximately 11 meters in diameter, smooth and metallic. Witnesses would later describe how he captured every detail: the dome on top, the panels along its surface, the way light seemed to dance across its hull. The mechanic in him was curious. If this was a military prototype that had landed for repairs or testing, maybe they needed help. Stefan stood, his legs stiff from sitting, and began walking toward the object. As he got closer, the air changed. It became warmer, thick with the smell of sulfur, like someone had struck 1,000 matches at once. A whirring sound filled his ears, mechanical and rhythmic, accompanied by a hissing that reminded him of air brakes on a factory floor. Then he saw it. A door open on the side of the craft, brilliant light spilling out from within, and voices, muffled by the mechanical sounds, but definitely voices, at least two, maybe more, engaged in conversation he couldn't quite make out. Stefan called out in English, his accent thick but his words clear. He offered help, telling the Yankee boys that if they needed mechanical assistance, he was qualified. The voices stopped. Silence, except for that persistent whirring and hissing. He tried again in Polish, the language of his childhood. Nothing. Then Russian, which he'd learned during his time as a military policeman in Poland. Still nothing. Finally, he attempted German. Only the machine responded, its sounds unchanged, indifferent to his presence. According to Stefan's account, given first to the RCMP and repeated consistently for the next 32 years of his life, he moved closer, close enough to touch. The craft's surface was unlike anything he'd encountered in his years working with metal. Perfectly smooth, no seams, no rivets, no welds. It looked as though it had been poured from a single piece of molten material. He pulled his welding goggles over his eyes, the ones he used when chipping at rocks to protect against flying stone fragments, and peered through the open doorway. Inside, beams of light crisscrossed through the air. Panels covered in lights of various colors blinked in patterns he couldn't decipher, but there was no one there. No pilot, no crew, no living thing that he could see. Stefan stepped back, his mind racing. As he did, 3 panels slid across the opening with mechanical precision, sealing the doorway shut. Without thinking, he reached out and placed his gloved hand against the hull. The fingertips of his glove melted instantly. Before he could process what had just happened, the craft began rotating counterclockwise. Stefan stumbled backward as the rotation revealed a new panel on the object's surface. A grid of holes, each about half an inch in diameter, arranged in a precise pattern. He had perhaps 2 seconds to register what he was seeing. Then the grid erupted. A blast of hot gas or air shot out from the holes with tremendous force, hitting Stefan square in the chest. The impact knocked him backward. His shirt ignited. His cap burst into flames. The smell of burning fabric mixed with that sulfurous odor as he tore at his clothing, ripping away the burning garments before they could consume him entirely. The craft lifted off. No countdown, no gradual ascent. Just a sudden upward surge, and it was gone, disappearing into the afternoon sky as quickly as it had arrived. Stefan stood there, chest heaving, skin screaming in pain. The forest spun around him. Nausea hit like a fist to the gut, and he bent over, vomiting into the underbrush. Disoriented, he tried to retrace his steps through the trees. Everything looked the same, and nothing looked familiar. His chest felt like someone had pressed a hot iron against it. The smell of sulfur clung to him, seeping from his pores. Somehow, he made it back to his motel room in Falcon Lake. He cleaned himself up as best he could, his hands shaking, and caught the bus back to Winnipeg. When he stumbled through his front door, his wife took one look at him and knew something terrible had happened. If you're enjoying this story and want to hear more mysterious encounters like this, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with anyone who questions what might be out there. Your support helps us bring these incredible true stories to light. The next day, Stefan Michalak lay in bed, pale and haggard. His 9-year-old son, Stan, was allowed to see him for just a few minutes. The boy would never forget what he witnessed. His father looked like death, but it was the smell that would haunt young Stan for years. A horrible stench of sulfur and burnt motor oil pouring from his father's pores, filling the bedroom with an odor so thick it was almost visible. Within 48 hours, Stefan's wife convinced him to go to the hospital. When doctors examined his chest and stomach, they found burns arranged in a perfect grid pattern, matching exactly the configuration of holes Stefan had described on the craft. Over the following weeks, those burns developed into raised sores that refused to heal properly. Stefan lost weight rapidly. He suffered from chronic diarrhea, splitting headaches and blackouts that would strike without warning. But Stefan made a decision that would turn his family's life inside out. He reported what happened. In Poland, before immigrating to Canada, he'd served as a military policeman, and that training had instilled in him a sense of duty. If something dangerous was out there, people needed to know. They needed to be warned so they wouldn't get hurt the way he had. The story hit the Winnipeg Tribune newspaper, and according to Stefan Michalak, that's when everything hit the fan. The RCMP arrived first, followed by the Canadian Air Force, then various government agencies whose acronyms the family couldn't keep straight. American officials showed interest. The media set up camp on their lawn. Reporters knocked on their door at all hours. Curiosity seekers drove past the house slowly, staring. Some people camped on the grass, waiting for a glimpse of the man who'd been burned by a UFO. Strangers followed young Stan to school, peppering him with questions he couldn't answer. The family's small River Heights bungalow became a circus. Phone calls came day and night. Investigators wanted to interview Stefan again and again, asking the same questions in slightly different ways, looking for inconsistencies that never appeared. His story remained unchanged, detail for detail, every single time he told it. But the investigation went deeper than interviews. Authorities returned to the landing site and found exactly what Stefan had described. A circular area, approximately 15 feet in diameter, scorched clean of moss and vegetation, while the surrounding rock remained covered in green growth. Soil samples were collected. When tested, they came back highly radioactive. Stefan's burned shirt and glove were sent to an RCMP crime lab for analysis. No one could determine what had caused the burns. The pattern was too precise, too unusual. It didn't match any known industrial accident or chemical exposure. About a year after the incident, investigators discovered pieces of metal that had somehow been melted into cracks in the rock at the landing site. Those metal fragments tested positive for radiation, and they remain radioactive to this day, more than 50 years later. The United States Air Force conducted its own investigation. Their official conclusion, filed away in government archives, unexplained. In 1968, still suffering from recurring burns that would reappear on his chest and ongoing blackouts, Stefan traveled to the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. The doctors there performed extensive examinations and sent him to a psychiatrist, standard procedure for cases that defied medical explanation. The psychiatrist's report was unambiguous. Stefan Michalak was pragmatic, down to earth, and did not make up stories. Yet the public wasn't so kind. Some people called him a liar. Others suggested he was mentally ill. Stefan Michalak was bullied at school, taunted by children who'd heard their parents dismissing his father's story. The Michalak family endured years of condemnation and criticism before the attention finally died down. Stefan never backed away from what he'd witnessed, but he also never claimed to have seen aliens. When asked what he saw, he would describe it in intimate detail. The smooth metal, the lights, the grid of holes, the blast that burned him. But he would never say it was extraterrestrial. He believed, until the day he died in 1999 at age 83, that he'd encountered some kind of secret military craft. His son Stan, who co-authored a book about the incident 50 years later, puts it simply, his father's story never changed one iota, not in 32 years. And in all that time, with over 300 pages of documentation on the encounter, nothing has emerged to floor his account. On quiet mornings in Manitoba, when mist rises off Falcon Lake and catches the light just right, you can almost imagine what Stefan Michalak must have felt in that moment before everything changed. The solitude of the forest, the simple pleasure of searching for quartz, the normalcy of a spring day in 1967, and then the geese screaming, and then everything after. Stan Michalak admits he can't be close-minded about the possibility that what his father encountered was otherworldly. But he's also an aviation enthusiast, intimately familiar with how aircraft technology has advanced over the past half-century. According to his research, there was nothing even close to what his father described in development anywhere in the world at that time. No military prototype that could land silently on rock, rotate without visible propulsion, or emit a blast hot enough to melt metal and burn human flesh in a perfect grid pattern. The Canadian government still maintains files on the Falcon Lake incident. Researchers call it Canada's best documented UFO case, surpassing even Roswell, because unlike the United States, Canada officially acknowledges that something unexplained occurred. The physical evidence remains: the radioactive metal fragments, the photographs of Stefan's burns, the soil samples, the medical records from the Mayo Clinic, the psychiatric evaluation confirming his credibility. But none of it answers the fundamental question: what was that craft? Where did it come from? And why, on May 20th, 1967, did it land in the wilderness of eastern Manitoba and burn a man who only wanted to help? Stefan Michalak took those questions to his grave. His burns healed eventually, but they left scars, not just on his chest, but on his family, on his sense of safety, on the simple belief that the world operates according to rules we understand. He wished in his later years that he'd never said anything. The fame, the scrutiny, the endless questions, none of it was worth the price his family paid. But the evidence doesn't care about regret. It sits in archives and private collections, radioactive and real, waiting for an explanation that has never come. The rocks at Falcon Lake still bear the marks of something that landed there, something that shouldn't exist according to our understanding of physics and engineering. And somewhere in those endless forests of Manitoba, where the geese still call out across the water, and the ancient stone of the Precambrian shield holds secrets older than human memory, there's a place where moss refuses to grow. A circular scar on the earth, approximately 15 feet in diameter, where nothing has been quite the same since the day Stefan Michalak went looking for silver and found something else entirely. Something that burned him, something that changed him, something that was never explained. The craft lifted off and vanished into the sky, but the mystery remained, scorched into flesh and stone, waiting in the silence of the Canadian wilderness for someone to finally understand what it means. Disclaimer: this video is based on public reports, eyewitness testimonies, and speculative analysis. Some details remain unverified. All interpretations are intended for informational and entertainment purposes only.